Did Julius Caesar look like this? It's a shocking image that jars a lot of people. We're used to seeing the mighty Julius Caesar look like this and this, but I think those depictions are quite unlikely to be accurate. Hello, my name is Hadley, I'm an archaeologist, and in this video we're going to go over the evidence for what Julius Caesar actually looked like. We will, of course, have to discuss this infamous reconstruction, who made it, how it came about, and whether the mighty Julius Caesar looked anything like it. I think probably not. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in the year 100 BC in the city of Rome. He was from a very old and noble family, the Julii, who could trace their ancestry all the way back to Aeneas, who himself was the son of Venus, a literal goddess. It's unclear if anyone took this link to the divine literally during Caesar's lifetime, but we will go on to talk about that later. Caesar is by far the most famous Roman to have ever lived. He was a superb general, a shrewd politician, and managed to make himself dictator of Rome, which was a legitimate republican office, usually reserved for times of crisis. Like all good tyrants though, he was responsible for manufacturing the crisis that allowed him to take up power. Very clever. But he was also clever in enriching his supporters, including less well-off normal Romans. We all know the story from this point. He was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC at a senatorial meeting. That wasn't the end of the story for Caesar's image though. We know from literary sources that Julius Caesar had statues of him made whilst he was alive, and they were probably very realistic to his true form. In the late Roman Republic, it was very trendy to have yourself portrayed, warts and all, to show your maturity and your gravitas. Caesar, despite his obvious disregard for republican norms, probably subscribed to this fashion too. When Caesar achieved high office, it's very likely that a wax head would have been commissioned to commemorate this great achievement. It would have been stored in his family home. This was common for all Roman nobles who achieved such things, and the heads would have been brought out on special occasions like on funeral processions. The wax head was almost certainly made to physically resemble Caesar himself. Within 2 years of his assassination, he was deified by the Senate. He was literally turned into a god. And herein lies the main problem when reconstructing the image of Caesar. Virtually all sculptures that we have depicting Julius Caesar were sculpted after his death, and more importantly, after he was deified. His wax head doesn't survive, and we don't know if it was the model for any of these later sculptures. When the Romans depicted a literal god, there wasn't any need to depict him warts and all. Rather, it was more important to heroise Caesar. These sculptures from the immediate decades and centuries after his death do just that, and they are so different too. There is one bust of Julius Caesar that many archaeologists and art historians do think was made during his lifetime, and it's this one, the Tusculum bust. Far from showing the Caesar we all know and idealise, it shows a balding man with a large forehead and a wrinkly neck. I see my future. His head does appear to be asymmetrical too. It's not at all clear when the sculpture was made because, in general, sculptures are really difficult to date. You can't use carbon-14 dating because that only works on materials that were once alive. Other methods like optically stimulated luminescence don't work either for this kind of thing. Whenever archaeologists unearth sculptures, they can compare what else is found in the same context. Pottery, for example, especially if it has a maker's mark like this one does, is datable very precisely and can give us some information about when the sculpture was deposited, but it doesn't tell us when it was made. It wouldn't matter anyway because the archaeological context of the Tusculum bust is effectively lost forever. All we know is that it was from a villa at Tusculum. Some art historians and archaeologists have assessed the style and have concluded that it was probably from Caesar's own lifetime, although this is far from an archaeological fact. We're at a little bit of a dead end here, so let's see what the Roman writers say. Surprisingly, only one ancient source talks in any decent level of detail about what the mighty Julius Caesar looked like, and it's this man, Suetonius. He wrote a biography of the 12 Caesars from our Julius all the way to Domitian. He loved talking about all kinds of juicy gossip, but he did have access to the Imperial Archive, so it was actually quite an amazing source despite his salacious nature. I've printed off an English translation, so let's hear what he says about Caesar. He is said to have been tall of stature, with fair complexion, shapely limbs, a somewhat full face, and keen black eyes. Sound of health, except towards the end. He was subject to sudden fainting fits and to nightmare as well. He was twice attacked by the falling sickness, that's probably epilepsy, during his campaigns. He was somewhat overnice in the care of his person, not only being carefully trimmed and shaved, but even having superfluous hair plucked out, as some have charged. While his baldness was a disfigurement which troubled him greatly, since he found that it was often the subject of the jibes of his detractors. Because of it, he used to comb forward his scanty locks from the crown of his head, and all of the honours voted him by the Senate and people, there was none which he received or made more gladly use of than the privilege of wearing a laurel wreath at all times. Other than his fair complexion, black eyes, full face and balding head, we don't really have much to work on there. What does a somewhat full face mean anyway? I do particularly enjoy the section about Caesar strategically placing his laurel wreath on his receding hairline, a tactical masterstroke. A couple of other sources mention it too, so it's probably accurate. Anyone with a fringe can surely relate to this, not that I'd know anything about that. But this description is remarkably light on actual detail. It's by no means a passport description. I mean, we don't even know what his actual hair colour was like. Instead, it fits into the well-known trait of ancient writers trying to associate physical appearance with personality traits. So that's another dead end then, isn't it? Well, luckily for us, there are literally thousands of contemporary portraits of Julius Caesar that litter archaeological sites. They even have his name attached to them, and they are often datable within a year or two. Coins. I think that coins are by far the best contemporary evidence that we have for what Julius Caesar looked like. Controversially, he was the first living Roman to have his portrait on a Roman coin, and this did not end well for him because within a few months he was dead. You see, Roman Republican politicians spent a lot of effort trying not to do things that kings did, rule forever, wear crowns and put their faces on Roman coins. Some historians have even labelled this as the coin that killed Caesar. Of course, Caesar did many kingly things, like having himself declared as perpetual dictator, he sat in a golden chair during certain public events, and of course put his head on a Roman coin. Marcus Junius Brutus, et tu, Brute, that Brutus, was a ringleader in Julius Caesar's assassination, and ironically, after Caesar's death, Brutus minted coins with his own face on them. In this coin, he is boasting of his involvement in killing Caesar here. You see the dagger and the date, the Ides of March, the Palais cap, which was often given to free slaves, showing his motivation behind the assassination, freedom from tyranny. This would have been obvious to the people of ancient Rome. I do need to clarify one point, however. Whilst Julius Caesar was the first living Roman to put his face on a Roman coin, he wasn't the first to have his head on a coin in general. Titus Quinctius Flamininus was a general, and he was instrumental in the conquest of Greece. Many Greeks saw him as a liberator from the Macedonian yoke, and as a reward they put his face on a Greek coin. But this didn't cause a scandal, because this was in the Greek East and on a Greek coin, whereas Caesar rubbed the senators' noses in his kingly power in Rome, and ultimately he paid the price. On this coin, Julius Caesar looks very gaunt, with a thin, wrinkly neck, and again, a rather large forehead. His laurel wreath is conveniently covering a possibly receding hairline, which according to the imperial biographer Suetonius, is something that he did. There are many different depictions on different coin issues that show a varied Julius Caesar. This is because the die engravers who made these depictions had differing skills and were working from different source material. Some have may actually used Caesar himself in the flesh as a reference, but I suspect most were just copying from a portrait in the form of a bust, so you'd have artists copying other artists. What we can say for certain though, is that Caesar was definitely alive when these coins are minted, so I think this is, to the best of our knowledge, what Julius Caesar looked like. We have to talk about this depiction then. Some have referred to it as an abomination, others have called it the big friendly giant, and some wretched individuals have even suggested that he looks like me in the future. Harsh. In 2018, the archaeologist and historian Tom Buitendorp presented this version of Gaius Julius Caesar to the National Museum of Antiquities in the Netherlands. He used the Tusculum bust as his main source, the one that we discussed earlier. He used coins, very good, you know how I feel about that, but he also claimed to use literary descriptions, although these are not descriptive enough for any kind of forensic reconstruction, in my opinion. What I do like about Beutendorf's portrait is that it doesn't attempt to idealise Caesar like most depictions of the dictator do. He also emphasises Caesar's deformed skull, apparently caused by difficulties during his birth, but I haven't been able to verify this in the ancient texts. Beutendorf relies heavily on the asymmetrical head of the Tusculum bust. I do love that this depiction stirred up discussion, and indeed, it's probably the only reason that you're watching this video. But I do have to be honest, it doesn't look very human. If Julius Caesar did look like this, then I would expect his odd appearance to feature in the Roman ancient texts, but they don't. So did Gaius Julius Caesar look like this? I don't think so. Most portraits that we typically see of the great dictator were made after he was assassinated and turned into a god. These sculptures were idealized and they were probably not intended to represent what he actually looked like. The Tusculum bust is probably the most accurate depiction of Julius Caesar in sculpture form. It may be from his lifetime, but that is just based on the style of it. Literary descriptions from ancient writers are also very interesting and contain a lot of juicy gossip, but they aren't good enough for recreating his image. Coins of Julius Caesar are by far the best evidence we have for what he looked like. Thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. Wale.